Hello everybody, it's Sally here and welcome to my series of introductory videos on using the Silver Reed LK150 knitting machine. This is this bed machine, very simple and easy to use, and I'm hoping to do, to begin with at least, these following topics for you. First of all, this is what we're going to be doing today, setting up and preparing to knit. Then we'll follow on and do casting on, several methods of casting on, certainly more than they've given you in the instruction book, and casting off, increasing and decreasing and using holding position and some other basic techniques to get you going on your knitting machine. The date as I'm doing this is the 5th of January 2021. And the UK, where I am located, has just gone into full-scale lockdown again for the coronavirus pandemic. And so I figured that, you know, perhaps quite a lot of you have had these maybe for a Christmas present or treated yourself to something to help you through these difficult times when a lot of us are spending a lot more time at home and looking for some hobbies and so forth to keep ourselves busy. Excuse me, I'm just going to adjust my microphone, that's a bit better. I'm a member of several Facebook groups, an admin on the beginners and returners circle, but a member on some of the others specific to the LK150, and see repeatedly the same queries coming up from people who've had a machine recently, and obviously hitting the same kind of little stumbling blocks that we've all been through in the past. And so I hope these videos will help you learn to love your new machine. So, right, what are we going to do next? Oh yes, you should, when you get your machine out of its box, certainly if you've got a new one, it should definitely come with an instruction book, which is what that LK150 one instruction book. If you haven't got one because you've got a second-hand machine, you can get free instruction books from machineknitting.etc.com, free downloads on the internet. And as I was saying just now, there's lots of beginner help on the Machine Knitting Beginners and Returners Circle on Facebook. So do, if you're not already a member, do ask to join. There are 3 joining questions that you need to answer to be allowed to join, but nothing terribly invasive. And there's lots and lots of help and some knit-alongs that have been done on the LK150 and lots of other little projects that will get you going as well. And just in case you've got an older version of this machine, just a reminder that Silver Reed is now the global brand name for the group of knitting machines that were known certainly in the UK by the names Knitmaster and a long time ago Empeisel, probably not applicable to the plastic one, but certainly some of the old metal ones, and in America and Australia and South Africa and other places overseas known as Singers and Studios. But they are all the same machine. So if yours says it's a Singer or a Studio LK150, it'll be exactly the same as the Silver Reed. So if you're looking for information around the internet, don't necessarily get too hung up on it having your particular brand name on it. As long as it's got one of these and the model number is the same, it'll be the same thing. This is a mid-gauge machine. The distance between 2 of the needles is 6.5 millimeters. There was an earlier version of it, I think it was an LK140, which obviously had 140 needles instead of this one's 150. And there is a very similar chunky version known, I think, as a Zippy 90. It's a 9mm machine, and then later the LK100. They work in a very similar way to this, not necessarily having all the same buttons and levers, but the method of operation is very, very similar. So let's get cracking. Now then, the first thing you need to decide when you've got your knitting machine is where you're going to use it. You do need to put it on a flat, level surface that's got a decent edge to it that you can clamp the machine to. It comes supplied with 2 clamps, which are designed to obviously to clamp the machine to the table surface. I've got this double-sided bespoke wooden knitting machine table. I'm just going to quickly show you a different type of table that is very common, which is, let's get my hand off the camera, which is this one. Turn it up that way. As you can see, it's got fold-away legs, but it's basically got like a Formica top, very flat edges to it. But the thing to notice about these bespoke tables is that the legs are not straight. They splay out both from front to back and from side to side. It's not such a crucial thing for this plastic machine, but if you venture into owning a metal machine and adding a ribber to it, having it on a stable surface is extremely important, and it's important to get the weight distribution correct. If you put it on something that's got vertical legs, or the legs are too close together, it's very, very unstable, because all of the weight is hanging off the front of off the side of the table, and of course one false move and the whole thing can just tip over, and either your machine is going to crash to the floor and get maybe permanently damaged, or it might all end up in your lap. And there's nothing more unpleasant than having 40 pounds of sharp pointy metal landing on your knees, and we don't want that. So make sure that wherever you put your machine, you put it on a sturdy, safe table. I know in this day and age it's not possible for everybody to find a little location where they can leave their machine out permanently, but if you can, it's a good idea, because if you have to keep putting it away, getting it out, putting it away, getting it out, you end up not using it, and we don't want that, do we? When I'm not using my machine, I just cover it up with an old pillowcase or two, keep the dust off it. Other than that, it's out all the time. So you've got your machine out of its box, and in the instruction book it should give you a list of all the bits that it comes with. Obviously information on how to set the machine up. So I'm just checking that this position is okay. Just make sure that you've got everything that has been listed in the instruction book that it should come with, the accessories that are supplied with it. I don't believe the LK150 comes with its own little toolbox, but I find these things are very, very useful. These long boxes that have these click-on lids, and as you can see, I've got several of them, and they are long enough to accommodate the cast-on combs, so they're really ideal. Accessories, yeah, so just make sure that everything is there that should be there. Before you go ahead and clamp your machine to the table, this applies particularly to second-hand machines, but also to new ones, because you might have bought it new, but you don't actually know how long it might have been sitting in a warehouse before it was delivered to you, and it might have been there for a couple of years or more. And these needles are held under tension by means of a sponge strip that runs along the width of the machine inside it, and designed to keep the needles from being too loose and floppy, so that they will hold their positions whilst you're knitting. In order to check that your sponge is in good condition, all you need to do is just to tip the machine up like that, and as long as these needles all stay put up there in A position, your sponge is fine. If they're falling down here, or worse, down here, then you need to replace the sponge. So let's just tip it right over so I can show you where the sponge is located. It's located here, and you will need to take all the needles out, replace the sponge and put it back again. Now before you turn it back over again, there's two little white knobs on the end of here. If you can, so I have to keep peering around here to make sure that you can see what I'm doing. So there it is. These are needle bed extenders, and I always put mine out before and there's one at this end as well, before I put the machine into place, because I knit a lot of wide pieces of knitting, and it just enables the carriage to run off the side of the needle bed without falling on the floor. So put your needle bed extenders out, and then get your two clamps and underneath here there's two locations where you can clamp it to the table. Now I have to admit that because I've got other knitting machines as well, I have spare clamps knocking around the place, and there is another, again I hope you can see what I'm doing, another clamping location in the middle of the machine here, and I do, because I just happen to have a spare clamp, I do clamp the third one on here. This is only because these machines, as you can see, they're very flexible, and particularly if your table isn't that level, they can flex up and down, which can affect the machine's knitting. It might cause you to lose stitches or so forth. So I do put a third one on, but if you obviously haven't got a third clamp, you're going to have to do without. There we go, it's all clamped in place, that's it. Now the yarn is fed to the knitting machine through an overhead mast, which is the long plastic stick, and it sits in this little socket which just pushes into the back there. It's around about between needles 10 and 20 on the left hand side, and that just clips in. Make sure you push it right in. And there's also this little triangular piece that goes on the back of the mast that the yarn travels through before it goes up through the overhead assembly, and that just slots into there. And then you've got this thing, or the aerials sometimes I call them, and they just twist round and click into place, and then you'll see there's this little oval shaped slot underneath that it just sits on top of that mast there. So let me just move my camera away for a bit so that you can see the top of this as it should be. There it is, sitting in the slot at the back. The yarn mast, there's your wire triangle yarn guide, and there's the overhead assembly sitting on the top, and there's your wire guides for your yarn flapping about up there. Put that back. Move this a little bit further away. It's always extremely difficult for me to gauge whether the camera is in a good position, because when I've got it on a still photograph, it doesn't zoom in. As soon as I put it on video, it zooms in. Anyway, there is also your row counter. Slides into this little slot on the back there, just around about needles 10 to 15 on the right hand side. And then here is your carriage, and that just slides on at the side. Again, I'll make sure that this groove at the back here sits on top of this little rail, and just slide it on, and it should slide up and down quite happily. Obviously there's no needles in work at the moment, but it shouldn't feel gritty or sticky or anything like that. If it does, then there's something wrong with the machine, the carriage, or whatever. It might be that it just needs a little bit of oil. Although these are plastic machines, they do need oil. And this is sewing machine oil that I bought from a local haberdashery shop quite a long time ago. Again, if you've got a new machine, you should get a little bottle of oil that comes with it. It's exactly the same as this, and this is perfectly okay for all knitting machines. Whatever you do, don't spray silicone lubricant onto your machine. I know there's people out there who are going to disagree with me on this, but and I'm sure there's probably 12 different types of silicone, but I'm not a silicone expert, and I wouldn't know whether I got the right one or the wrong one. And this stuff, you can clean it off. When it gets dirty, fluffy and mucky, a bit of white spirit and a cloth, and you can clean it away and replace it with fresh. If you start squirting silicone spray into your machine, you cannot get that stuff out. And over the years, it will build up into a nice little set of superglue cement that will eventually clog your machine up. And then, to use the English vernacular, it's buggered. You can't get the silicone out and your machine is ruined. So please, people, don't put silicone into your machine. Manufacturers recommend oil. I always figure that the manufacturers do that for a reason, because oil is the best thing for it. That's my bit of sermonising over. Put that over there. So that's it really. Your machine is now set up and ready to start knitting. Just a word or so about the carriage settings. These are explained in your book. It really is a fairly simple machine to operate. Let's just run through what they do. The names and the functions of each part. Well, we've gone through the setting up here. Here is your needle bed. There are marked on the end, there's A, B, C and D are 4 needle positions. At the minute all of the needles are A, which is known as non-working position or out of work. If you bring them forward to B position, that is the normal working position. So I'm just double checking you can see it, yep. And C position is upper working position, and D position, when they're right out the front here, is holding position. The needle bed is marked with a centre naught. I have to confess that because I'm middle-aged and wear varifocals these days, oh excuse me, I haven't got COVID, honest, sorry, yes, there's a centre naught here and I can't really see these pink and white numbers all that clearly anymore, so I've overdone mine with a permanent black marker, and I put these 2 red lines in the middle of my needle bed so that I can quite easily see where the centre naught is. It's a bit distracting sometimes when you've got things that aren't centred on the machine. You tend to think this is the middle of it, but it isn't, it's here. And it counts out in groups of 10, out to the left and out to the right. There's 75 on both sides, and helpfully as well they also have these coloured little roller cap things on these needles. These do pull off because a spare needle, oh, here's a couple here, you can see one has got its roller cap on it, a grey one, and the other one hasn't. That's what the needles look like. So if you need to replace a needle, take the plastic thingy off the top of it because you'll need it to put on the replacement. Yeah, so they're marked in grey and pink going out from the centre on both sides, and you have a total of 150 needles on this machine. So I've shown you how to put the carriage on the needle bed and slide it on from the end. If your carriage jams at all and you need to remove it, you just have to click this lever at the back, push that down. Oh, you have to turn your handle up, by the way, because it will be flat in the box. You can just press that lever at the back and the carriage will just lift off. And then you put it back again at the end. There we go. Alright, so looking through, we've done the needle positions. The stitch dial on the machine here, this is what determines how tight or loose your knitting is. The smaller the number, the tighter the knitting, and the dot is, I don't know why it's not in the middle, but it's not. It's at about 7-8 o'clock position on the left hand side, and so you line up the number on the dial with this dot to tell you what needle size that or stitch size that your machine is going to knit at, and it clicks right the way around up to 9. And then there are additional settings on the inner ring, 10 to 13. These are used when you're knitting thicker yarns on alternate needles, but for regular knitting where you're using every needle, there's 1 through to 9. There's also this R setting down here which you can use for when you're setting up to knit a mock rib or a latch rib, I believe. So there we go, that's your stitch size dial. I'll talk a little bit more in a minute about the yarns that you can use on here. Let's just go through the working of the levers. There's 2 levers on either side of the carriage, one at the back and one about halfway up. The one at the back is known as the side levers, and they control needles that are in working position. So when the needle, the selector is back at the triangle mark, let's just lift this off here so you can see there's 2 marks, a triangle and a circle. Yeah, so when the lever is back at the triangle mark, it will knit the needles that are in the B position. So you would use this for all stockinette knitting, plaiting or tuck stitch. If you don't want to knit the needles in B position, you just slide that lever forward to the circle, and it will ignore needles that are in B, it will not knit them. So this is a setting that's used for slip stitch and also for Fair Isle. Fair Isle on this non-patterning machine is actually a form of slip stitch because you knit the two colours alternately. So you're knitting one colour, slipping the other one, and then knitting the second one and slipping the first. So it does not knit Fair Isle knitting two colours simultaneously. Fair Isle on here is a form of slip stitch. So when those needles are forward, you normally the carriage settings are normally on both sides when you're pattern knitting, unless your instructions tell you otherwise. But for most knitting, plain knitting, it's always back on the triangle. So and the left-hand lever obviously controls when it's moving in that direction. So when you're knitting from right to left, this lever controls what the needles do. And when you're going back in that direction from left to right, the lever on this side controls what the carriage does. So the lever nearest to the needles in the direction of travel is the one that is affecting what the work will do. And now the levers in the middle are called Russell levers, and there are two settings for these again. There's one and there's two. And this lever is for controlling needles out in D position, for use when you want to do shaped knitting and short rowing, shoulder shaping, that kind of thing. If I show you this now, I've left the Russell levers on 2, and there's needles out of D, and as I pass the carriage over it will knit them back. So let's put them back to B, and if I put the lever back to 1, put the needles back out to D and go over it again, it's left them in D. So the Russell levers are very important for when you're doing holding position. So that's carriage settings. I think that's possibly about it in terms of what the thing basically does. As well as all the bits that attach to the machine, you will have got a lot of different tools with it. You'll get ravel cords, which are these shiny cords. You'll get cast on combs. They're very stingy these days and only give you 2 claw weights. I would strongly recommend you get more. These big cast on combs can be used as weights, but they're quite unwieldy, and I find using a lot more claw weights is much more preferable. I've got obviously lots of machines, and I've bought and broken up machines over the past, so I've now got a whole selection of claw weights, and I find that I need at least 5, if not 7, or even more than that, depending on what I'm doing. Especially if I've got a big piece on here and I'm shaping it, you need to keep it weighted all the way across. So purchase yourself some extra claw weights, and then you also get a whole load of transfer tools, which are used for moving stitches from one to t'other, one needle to another one. And you'll get a latch tool, which mine has got 2 different size hooks on it. One at the bottom is thinner, is smaller for finer yarns, and a bigger one at the top for heavier weight yarns. And you get these needle pushers. And that's one I basically broke up myself to get another 3x1 pusher. So these are used for if you need to push out specific groups of needles into different positions on the needle bed. And then these things, very important. These are your tension rulers, even though I hate using the word rulers, but the whole world and his dog refers to them as rulers, but they aren't rulers really, they're scales. because there isn't inches or centimetres on these things. They have a mathematical algorithmic scale on them, which does a very clever piece of conversion when you've knitted your tension piece to a specific set of rows and stitches, and it will measure your tension piece for you and automatically calculate how many stitches per 10 centimetres you have and how many rows per 10 centimetres. If you're old-fashioned like me and like working in inches, you just divide those numbers by 4, but we'll cover tension pieces a little bit later on. So that's it. This is how you're going to set up your machine. How long have I been yapping on for? 25 minutes. So we'll just have a little word about yarn preparation. Now, ideally, you'd like to buy yarn on cone to use on a knitting machine. But it has to be said that there isn't much in the range of yarns that this machine likes to knit that you can get on cone. I mean, I do have an odd, I think that's Aran weight, an odd 1 or 2, but the majority of the yarns that you're going to knit on here will come as balls. Now, maybe some people do it, but I really don't recommend it. Knitting from the ball isn't a good idea. You need to rewind them, and you can either rewind them using a small ball winder. Let's just fish this one over here, like this one, which will wind one ball, that kind of size, quite happily. Or you can use a larger cone winder. I've had this quite a number of years, and I must admit it's an absolute beaut. It will enable me to wind 3, if not 4, 100-gram balls into one big cone. And yeah, I've got a good long length of yarn that I can knit with before I need to worry about winding another one. I mark you can possibly see this piece of blue sticking out the top. When I'm putting 2 or more balls on the same plastic centre, I call them a hat, on here, when I get to a join, I mark it with a piece of very strongly contrasting thread. This is what this hideous pink stuff is up here for. It's for yarn markings, so even blind old me can't miss it. And so when you've got the thing on the table behind you, as it unravels as you're knitting, when you get to that join, that nice coloured piece of yarn should show up quite good and clear, and you end up not knitting it through. But if worst comes to the worst, you might end up knitting one row and having to pull it back, but hey, at least all your knitting won't be on the floor because the yarn end has come through and it's all fallen off the machine. The way I wind from a ball is I try to find the middle. So you have to like rummage around inside the ball of wool and hope that you'll find the end in the middle, because that will wind onto the cone much more smoothly than having it bouncing around as you're trying to wind it, because you'll just get uneven tension, and you might have to rewind it a second time if that's the case. So the other little gadget I've got is intended for hand knitters. It's this wooden spike on a stick that just twiddles round and round, and this is quite great for if you've got these small little balls that you've wound on your ball winder, because you can just poke it onto the stick and then it'll twiddle around quite happily and unravel a lot more smoothly as well. So I can't even remember what it's called, a ball holder, something like that, but I got mine from Amazon. It was about £8 or £9, so not very expensive. So that comes down now then to what yarns can you knit on here. Well, this machine is designed to knit 4-ply up to, they say, chunky yarn on every other needle. I have to say, because I have a chunky machine, I haven't ever actually tried to knit a chunky yarn on mine, but I have knitted 4-ply up to an Aran weight on it quite happily, using every needle, and it knits it perfectly smooth. The favourite yarn weight I use on mine is double knitting, because it is by far and away in the UK the most popular way of knitting yarn. If you go into any hand knitting yarn shop in this country, you will find hundreds and hundreds of different kinds of double knitting yarn. The tension setting or stitch size setting that I use most often for double knitting yarn is about a number 4 on here. Sometimes if it's a little bit thinner it might be 3, or if you've got a really thick one it might be 5. 4-ply yarn, again I've got a standard gauge machine, so I don't tend to use 4-ply on here because I knit that on my standard, but I would need to turn that dial right down to about 1 for a 4-ply, UK 4-ply that is. 3 to 4 for a double knitting. Worsted weight yarns obviously very popular in America, not quite so common over here, although we do get them. They probably knitted around about stitch size 7, and then the Arons up to about 8. But in a lot of cases it comes down to trial and error. You'll be needing to knit your tension piece to find out. Here is one I did earlier. It's a tension piece, and one of the trickiest things I think for people transitioning from hand knitting to machine knitting is this whole hoary question about tension. Now this machine is specifically designed really to knit a lot of, or to work with a lot of hand knitting yarns, but you will find you will hardly ever be able to match the stated tension. Every ball of wool, certainly sold in the UK, is going to have on it a recommended needle size and what your expected tension should be per 10 centimetres, and this one is 25 stitches and 34 rows. Now I tend to find that I can very often quite easily get a stitch match on the tension on the machine, but the rows are going to be off just because it knits in a different way. You're using hundreds of needles instead of 2. But the important thing about once you've knitted your piece, okay, you might have matched the tension. Does it feel right? There's no point matching tension if what you then have in your hand either looks like a string vest or feels like a lump of old carpet. You wouldn't want to wear it either way. So the important thing is to end up with a nice piece of knitting that feels and handles really well. So we'll cover tension and patterns a little bit later on, but that's just giving you a bit of an idea, I hope, about the range of yarns that your machine can knit. I'm just going to grab one of my American knitting books, she said with a dreadful American accent, because somewhere in here there will be one of your lovely yarn charts. Oh, here we go. So yarn weight categories. In the UK we tend to have very standardised, well, we call them weights or plies of yarns, but in actual fact it refers to a thickness. So a 2-ply will be a specific thickness, 3-ply, 4-ply, double knitting, Aran and chunky. And anyone in the UK has been a hand knitter for donkey's years, you'll know that if you go and buy double knitting yarn, it knits on 4mm needles, old English size 8s. 3-ply will knit on, 4-ply will knit on 3¼ needles, and so on and so forth. But in America you use these yarn weight categories. Now the weights of yarn that will knit most happily on this are the ones that are going to fall in the light and medium category, 3s and 4s. You might get to knit some 5s on alternate needles, and you might also get to knit some sport or baby yarns on here right down at the lowest tension. But here you got it, you got DK, light worsted, Afghan and Aran, and that's the yarn range for the United States that will knit most happily on this machine. It is also quite accommodating for things that aren't necessarily particularly smooth yarns, so hairy stuff, lumpy stuff and so forth, yarn with glitter in it. It's a great little machine to experiment with, so if you're not sure, maybe just buy one ball, take it home, wind it and have a go. Right, so that is, I think, the end of the preparation video. On the next one we'll start talking about actually casting on and knitting.